Hello, good time of day to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Um, my name is Bridget Burns. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the executive director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization. Um, and I'm joined by my two colleagues who are experts in the area of financing for climate and environment and gender equality and human rights for what is going to be hopefully a discussion on the critical intersections of climate change, climate finance, and gender equality in this moment. We are hosting a series of What's at Stake dialogues. These are short conversations that we as a team who are engaged in a number of different policy spaces are having together. And we wanted to invite folks in. Folks have been sending us questions and things that they have, concerns that they have, and questions that they have about what's actually at stake at this upcoming COP, the year of climate finance. And so we wanted to give you an opportunity and a moment to be together in a short conversation, because I know we're all very busy. And understand a bit what our perspectives are as an organization on what the critical issues going into these moments look like. If you do at any point in this conversation, which will happen amongst the three of us, have any questions, we would invite you to use the question and answer button. We also have some questions that folks have shared with us that we're going to be trying to cover in this conversation. So I'm just going to get started with a little bit of grounding in why we were particularly talking about this theme. We understand from many of the conversations from the news reports and the media of what this year looks like, that folks are saying this is the year where policy spaces are really trying to tackle how we shift funding and resources. Our policy experts, Tara and Mishi, who will introduce themselves quite in just a minute, have been following the spaces around climate, around biodiversity, all within this framework of how do we actually move money in a way where resources are supporting and scaling solutions at the intersections of people and planet, and namely how they are supporting local thriving economies that center gender justice and human rights. Often when we speak about climate finance and gender intersections, we find that we're discussing the issue at a multiplicity of levels. And the thing that feels unfortunately common amongst all of these levels is that our starting point is scarcity. We simply do not have enough resources at government level, multilateral level, at local level to be able to move things in the way that we see are really gender just, gender-based solutions. So we're often thinking about this from the perspective of existing multilateral and climate finance institutions. How do we make these existing institutions, quote unquote, more gender responsive? And that work often involves us doing advocacy within spaces like the Green Climate Fund, where Tara has just come from a board meeting, for example. And that starting point of work that many folks are maybe used to or come to this space with an understanding of is how do we get the word gender in some of the policy frameworks that exist, and some of the requirements that we have around what those projects look like. But we also know that within these same institutions, the barriers for reaching community levels or being transformative are well beyond, for example, just creating a gender policy within some of those multilateral institutions. And so we then spend a lot of time talking about how these institutions are simply not fit for purpose in delivering climate action at a local level. We're discussing the quality of finance. We're discussing the quantity of finance in a lot of the discussions. How much do we need? What's the big number? And does the big number matter if we don't have good quality finance? And what does quality mean? We're often talking about the real need to push for grants over loans, for example, as part of the way and the vehicle in which we deliver that finance. We discuss the fact that the pot of money going to climate and gender as a whole is not large enough, but we also know that that's part of a broader macroeconomic issue of where money is currently being invested, where we need to divest from to increase the pie, increase the amount of available resources that we can invest in gender equality and human rights. We discuss the need for investment in public finance versus private finance and all of the challenges that come with that. And we spend a lot of time talking within feminist movements and with activists about how we need resources now on the ground for the solutions that matter. And the fact that, again, there's deep scarcity in the amount of available resources that are currently going to fund grassroots organizations working at the front lines, at the intersections of women's rights, climate justice, are some of the least resource solutions that we see. And so how do we tackle this multiplicity of issues, this very multidimensional challenge? And it's really hard to have all these conversations at the same time. And what we tend to do is in moments like this, where we know COP29 will have negotiations around a new collective quantified goal on finance, to kind of put all of our energies into those moments, to say, okay, we need to do all of these things. And this might be our moment for delivering that. And I think sometimes we are maybe missing where the real advocacy and leverage points are, and maybe misunderstanding what the challenges in front of us are in these current moments versus where we need to be building power and building advocacy across multiple streams in order to be able to have an impact. And so we wanted to start this, and I hope for those of you who are joining us, you'll be interested in following with us throughout not just this session, but in multiple sessions we're planning on having in the coming months. We're renewing a commitment to a learning and dialogue series around gender equality, human rights, and finance, financing for environment and climate, because we know this is such a multidimensional challenge to how do we actually get the resources where they need to go. And this is really just kind of a kickstart and a fire start conversation amongst our colleagues, to really think about what is the moment that's coming up 2 weeks from now, less than 2 weeks probably, at COP29 in particular, but also to hear from Tara and from Mishi, who've been on kind of whirlwind whistle-stop tours to the Green Climate Fund board meeting, to COP16 in Colombia and in Cali, and to the pre-COP in Baku just a few weeks ago, on some of the trends that we're hearing and what we can expect out of this year, and where we can see potential levers for change and where we need to build going forward. And so I'm going to just get us started, and maybe I'm going to start with Tara, who I would say, Tara, please introduce yourself, but I know that you are, I don't want you to be overly humble in how you introduce your expertise around this area. Tara has been working specifically on climate finance for over 5 years now, and more than that in terms of working on environment and human rights at these intersections. And she's currently the active observer for developed countries to the Green Climate Fund, and I think has been to every Green Climate Fund board meeting for the last 3-4 years. I'm not sure. You can correct me on exactly how many. And has been really diligently trying to shape what climate finance looks like in those spaces. And outside of just those specific mechanisms, you also, of course, lead the working group on climate finance for the women and gender constituency. And so COP29, we're hearing a ton about this being a climate finance COP. The NCQG, which is one of those fun, inaccessible acronyms that we come up with in the UNFCCC, which is about the new collective quantified goal. What is that all about? Is this a key advocacy opportunity for the multiplicity of issues that we have on delivering gender just climate finance? And what do you think is important about what the opportunities for advocacy are in this moment that we're maybe not discussing enough? And I know that's kind of a lot, so I'll give you some time to kind of walk us through and paint a picture for what's happening in this current moment. Over to you, Tara.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Bridget. And it's great to be in this conversation. So indeed, I love diving into the technical details of climate finance. I think you're right that I've been to something like 19 of the last 20 Green Climate Fund board meetings. But when we're talking about this new collective quantified goal, this NCQG, even though it's a mouthful and even though it sounds really technical, I think the conversation that we should be having about it a lot more and the opportunity that it poses is about the ways in which it really speaks to the fundamental aspects and elements of the Paris Agreement and the aspirations of the Paris Agreement. So first of all, what is the NCQG? What is this process? So the goal will be set after the culmination of a years-long process, 3 years to be specifically. But this process was first envisioned, and then the idea that there would be a process when the Paris Agreement was adopted, because they knew that there was a need to both replace and improve upon the goal that was in existence at the time of the Paris Agreement, which was this $100 billion goal set back in 2009 and that was supposed to be met by 2020. Now, who was this goal for? It's for developed countries fulfilling part of their climate finance obligations in terms of the climate finance that they are providing to developing countries under the UNFCCC. So as there has been this process to figure out the quantum, the amount of the goal, and all of its qualitative aspects through multiple technical expert dialogues and now meetings of this ad hoc work program, I think it's important that we look at this big picture about how this speaks to the effectiveness and the trust and even just the process of how the Paris Agreement works. So first of all, the effectiveness of the Paris Agreement. So we know that the Paris Agreement uses as like this fundamental unit, this commitment that's being made by each country, the nationally determined contribution, to think about these individual contributions contributing to this collective climate ambition that we need to see in this moment. And when the NDCs of developing countries have been costed, most recently in the Standing Committee on Finance's Determination of Needs report, they've just done a second edition of it that'll be published in full right around COP, but we have some of the preliminary numbers, and we know that to actually implement those current NDCs, knowing that we have a whole new generation of NDCs that we're going to start seeing over the next few months, that it will cost at least 6.8 trillion of finance between now and 2030. And that there's so many reasons why that is an underestimate. But we know fundamentally to fulfill these NDCs, there has to be finance. And that the IPCC in its latest report and talking about the pathways to still achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, one of the things that they recognized is that a barrier is climate finance. So we're talking about something that's really fundamental to our ability to achieve the Paris Agreement and fundamental to signal our willingness to achieve the Paris Agreement, because we know that there is trillions of dollars worth of funding out there, but it's often misdirected towards fossil fuel subsidies, towards militarization, which reached $2.4 trillion in 2023 alone. And so this fundamental question of, are these NDCs from developing countries that are conditional upon receiving climate finance, are they able to be fulfilled? That's something that this goal is going to help signal to to the countries that are party to the Paris Agreement. So this starts to think not only about the effectiveness of the Paris Agreement, but this fundamental trust that needs to exist between parties in a multilateral system. And part of the trust that was built was the idea of the Paris Agreement setting forth that there would be a process to consider needs and to consider priorities prior to this new goal being set. And that's in part because this 2009 goal, this idea of $100 billion being achieved by 2020, which it totally wasn't, but that was a politically set number. And so the idea was this time we would learn from the past, to truly think about what it would take to deliver on, on the scope and the depth of the need that we are seeing. Bridget, you were there back in 2009. You were there when that original goal was set. You were there when the Paris Agreement was signed and the idea of a new and improved replacement goal was being set. Do you have any comments on what this means about the trust of parties in this process?
Yeah, no, that's a really fair point. And I think that what we are seeing right now and why this is so critical and as part of this what's at stake conversation is, we are both talking about the resources that are needed in this moment and trying to define what that looks like and how we're going to get that where it needs to go. And that's, I think, what we often focus on. And it's critical and it's important. But it's also about the fact that it took a huge amount of political momentum and power building to create the Paris Agreement as a whole, to get agreement around this mechanism, which the concerns of most developing countries and the push of developed countries was an agreement that shifted us away from a top-down regimented agreement that was about here's how much carbon you shouldn't be emitting anymore and something that could be recorded, to developed countries really saying we need a looser, more flexible agreement, more voluntary, that was facilitatory. That was one that we would build in a ratcheting was the term that they always use, which build in a mechanism for increasing ambition. And however many years later, I can't count at this point, we are from the Paris Agreement. This is not only are we not getting the resources where they need to go, but we are fundamentally proving developing countries to be right in their skepticism around the idea that you could build a mechanism and rely on the trust of other countries that they would little by little upgrade their ambition and upgrade the amount of resources that they would be providing, as well as their own domestic ambition around climate finance. And that this mechanism, this treaty, can't survive that complete erosion of trust and won't survive because it will be the fundamental kind of failing of the Paris Agreement itself. It's an agreement that is that can only achieve its goals if ambition is ratcheted up. And so I don't think we can underscore enough the importance of failing to deliver on an ambitious outcome around the new collective quantified goal, not just any decision, but really showing that there can be trust in this process because we are kind of in solidarity together as countries, that this is an issue we need to take seriously. And we are learning from the past. I think that was the spirit at which folks put aside their differences and came together in the Paris Agreement. And it definitely, for many reasons, risks really losing that spirit.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a sad commentary because it also speaks, as you were saying, to this process of the Paris Agreement. Like this entire idea that there would be these voluntary agreements, these voluntary nationally determined contributions, but then we would have this process to take stock, literally with last year's global stock take, which in a couple of minutes I'd love to have Mishi comment on as she was leading the Women and Gender Constituencies Working Group on that. But that in these moments, we would have the ability to look at the latest data, to look at the potential inadequacy of the action that's happening, and then collectively decide to ratchet up that ambition, as you were saying, Bridget. And so we're asking this fundamental question, which is the reality of this world that we are currently living in, does it influence the political will that we're seeing in this process? Does it make a difference in the climate ambition that we're seeing? We keep anticipating it will. We keep calling on it to, especially as we're continuing to see the devastation of climate chaos. And we have other ways in which, for example, through the the work that we're doing around gender and environment data, and JADA, the Gender and Environment Data Alliance, and really calling for gender disaggregated data, for example, we have to ask, if we're calling for this data and talking about its importance and hearing parties talk about its importance, we have to think about the ways in which sometimes data isn't enough if there isn't something that is responding to that, if there isn't this political process and this willingness to take up the technical findings and to act based on the data around the disparities that we are seeing, and the inequalities that we're seeing on a gendered lens worldwide. So Mishi, as I was just mentioning, you led the working group on the global stock take last year for the Women and Gender constituency. You know, from your perspective, do you have anything to add? And just before I come to you, because I think you need another moment for your technical setup, just some more thoughts on the idea that we need this moment, this design of the goal in both quantity and quality, and how it will be tracked and assessed, and how we're really going to be accountable, truly accountable for the goals that we are setting forth and agreeing to, and as part of maintaining this trust, the same way that indeed we were just talking about.
Sarah,
So
can I ask you just a follow
mhm,
up to the point that you just kind of raised here? So really raising the stakes for why it's important we have a strong outcome on NCQG. Could you give us some kind of color around what is possible at this point in terms of, or what's the potential expectation of an outcome on the NCQG as we start to get to going back to that question of, a lot of people are asking, what can we deliver for gender at this upcoming COP? So could you give us a bit around where we are with this outcome and what's possible to deliver for gender, knowing that we have so much more we need to discuss um, to actually move the needle on climate finance that delivers for gender equality?
yeah, so the most important thing we can do to deliver on gender is continue this drumbeat that we're hearing from the climate justice movement about the scale of the NCQG, the scale of the quantum, in terms of reaching at least 1 trillion in grant equivalent finance, and having the majority of that be grant-based finance, particularly and especially when it comes to adaptation and when it comes to loss and damage. Because while there are other qualitative elements that we really do want to see and can call for, and I think are making progress on in terms of seeing enhanced and simplified direct access, for example, for women and gender groups, grassroots groups, Indigenous groups, and having that be a component of the goal, in terms of ensuring that there is real tracking of the finance that's going to emerge from the goal, and thinking about how we can track the gender responsiveness of that finance, knowing that we expect the entire goal to be gender responsive. But ultimately, the biggest opportunity and the thing that is going to help us move the needle is ensuring that the scale of this goal, the scope of this goal, is meeting the scale of the need and is truly ratcheting up the ambition, to, at the very minimum, $1 trillion in terms of grant equivalent value, and then is set up to, again, have these cycles of periodic revision that are in alignment with the NDCs and with the global stock takes, because those too are cyclical processes, so that we can come back and ask this question again of, is this enough? And what more can and should we do, so that we're not moving the goalposts on the Paris Agreement, we're instead changing the scale of commitment of our own action so that we can still meet those goals laid out.
And maybe just one follow up, and then I'm going to bring Nishi in on this. You know, because I think there's different levels of expectations of what is going to be possible at this coming COP. And so when it comes to particular language is captured in a decision, what are sort of those boundaries of what is likely versus what is unlikely in terms of, so I know that in the context and the scope of the broader things that we need to look at with the NCQG, some of this is about getting specific language in different places and an outcome. But we've also, heard interest in, um, commitments to of exact numbers of finance to gender and climate finance, for example, or earmarking and things like that. Um, is this the place where that kind of advocacy would be happening, or are there a broad number of places beyond just these NCQG discussions where, as a whole, we're trying to push for advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. So while we are within the Women and Gender Constituencies Working Group on Climate Finance, really digging into the text and looking at the exact language that we want to be taking to negotiators in order to really embed a gender responsive and human rights based approach to the NCQG, it's important to not lose sight of all of the other ongoing climate finance agenda items and processes. As you mentioned, Bridget, I just came back from the 40th board meeting of the Green Climate Funds. And so one of the things that we want to do with the NCQG is ensure that there's a greater proportion of funding flowing into multilateral climate funds that serve the UNFCCC and that, for example, have shared governance, such as the Adaptation Fund, such as the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and such as the new Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, FRLD. That's pretty much a new acronym as they just named that fund this past July. So we want to be looking at how gender responsiveness is actually operationalized in these funds, the way that it is not just serving as a token mention, for example, of the idea of 50% women beneficiaries and the climate projects that are funded, but really in talking about the accessibility of finance to the local level, to talking about the quality of finance when we are looking at grants versus loan instruments, to talking about who are the actors that are really targeted? Are we looking at the base of the pyramid for the private sector? Are we looking at those micro, small, and medium enterprises that are so disproportionately involving and led by women, but are often left out of these really top-down approaches to climate finance? And so when we're looking at these elements, the guidance that the parties will be issuing to these operating entities of the financial mechanism, when we're looking at the review of the seventh financial mechanism, when we're looking at matters relating to the adaptation fund, and in reviewing the work of the Standing Committee on Finance and all of its reports, it's important that we're keeping these fundamental ideas around ambition and around the actual quality of gender responsive finance alive in every step and from every angle.
That's great. Thank you for that, Tara. Someone asked if we will be sharing a recording of this, and just to say that we will be doing so. Mishi, how are you? Welcome. Mishi's been with us, but Mishi was also commuting. And this relates to the question I have for you, because you have been on a whirlwind journey, both to Baku most recently, not most recently, Baku recently for the pre-COP, where finance was heavily discussed and on the agenda amongst ministers, as well as, of course, the COP16 biodiversity COP in Cali, Colombia, which you just got off a plane a few minutes ago from. And so thinking about this, one of the things that you wrote going into the COP16 in Colombia was the concerns around some of the trends in how parties are going about trying to fulfill their climate finance commitments, trends that you've seen in sort of this over reliance on the private sector, and analysis of how that could be really difficult and harmful for delivering the kind of gender responsive rights-based finance that we are looking for, and finance that, again, is that quality finance that speaks to all of the challenges that Tara just outlined to be able to invest in the type of solutions that we are often talking about and that we are seeing our partners leading on in communities around the world. That again, we're seeing this space is really just not fit for purpose for them. So we're always trying to hold those two things in our minds as we do advocacy, the deep advocacy we need to do for more money, for more climate finance, for talking to governments about fulfilling their commitments, which is that really big ask that we have, but recognizing that that ask is kind of that ask alone is not where the end point of our advocacy is, that we know that it's about the quality of that finance and the way that it is being delivered and the vehicles which it's being delivered via. So I just wanted to invite you in to speak to a bit more about what it is you wrote, the concerns that you had, and to share with us any trends that you're seeing from these meetings that you've just been in and the advocacy you've been engaging in.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and thank you, Tara, for putting quite a detailed background of what is at stake this year when it comes to finance. Yes, as Bridget said, as you have said, I have been attending all this meeting, and just to start with the last one, last before this one in the pre-COP, and just to echo what Tara is saying, I think what is coming out as the narrative, especially from government, from the global north, is this idea of investment goal, really working away from obligation and just wanting to have like a big number and say, this is what as government that we are investing on when it comes to climate change. And that's, as Tara has said, really walk away from everything that we envision SQG really is. So I think there will be, or there should be, a lot of very intentional advocates to ensure that we get back to the core, as Tara has said. And connecting that to the CBD, as it is a financier for COP29, is also named as a financier for CBD as well. And for those who don't know, CBD is the Convention of Biological Diversity, and they are having a COP right now. So the week 2 has just started yesterday, and we had a privilege to engage in week 1. So overall, I think what we are seeing in the CBD, it receives a very financial resources to begin with. So the commitment there and the pledges as not as, for example, as sufficient. It is estimated that the finance gap to address biodiversity loss range around 700 billion per year, but the target really that government has agreed is at least 20 billion per year. And this was set in the Montreal framework in 2022. However, since then until beginning of the COP, the only resources that were mobilized were only 200 million, 231 million to be exact. And yesterday, Monday, it was a finance day in the COP 16 in Cali, and parties were expected to pledge additional resources. And expectation of all of us was really parties will make a dent at least to deliver or to commit at least half of it, that is 10 billion, but which is, I believe, not surprise, only 163 million was committed. So making the total of what has been pledged from the beginning, only 394 million, not billion, million. This doesn't even, like, we're not even half to get to a billion, which is a far way target out of the 20 billion that was agreed, and a far away from the actual gap that we do see. So the finance really is at a crack of all this. And unfortunately, that what we are continue to see, especially, for example, in the CBD, is this language of like funds from everyone, from all the sources, and also from everyone. So even though there is a minimal pledges yesterday, and in all our accounts as a civil society, we feel that the COP has failed and government have failed to raise ambition when it comes to finance, but still you will hear a lot of celebratory tone when it comes to some of the subnational government have pledged, for example, Quebec, and that is what really the global north want to shape the narrative that this is not just their obligation, it's obligation to everyone, it's obligation of everyone. So the walking away from the core obligation is the common trend that we are seeing across the board, and also over reliance of private sector. Especially for CBD, there is tons of evidence that suggests that the private sector cannot help. Part of it moved from a core belief or core principle that natural resources and our diversity is a common good. They're not private properties that a group needs to be generating profit from. And if you're moving from private or you're mobilizing private money, what you're directly also saying that you are limiting completely access to women, and you are unlikely to deliver any resources which will address the intersection of biodiversity and gender. So that is the state of what we are seeing overall in terms of the trend and the concerns. And in this COP, it is expected that as well, parties will deliberate on either establishment of the new fund, but also agree on the resource mobilization strategy, which it's full of market-driven solutions, including biodiversity offset, green bond, etc. Like all of it is literally a market solution, which doesn't work to advance gender equality in the intersection of biodiversity. So that is what I will say, Bridget. I don't know if you have any question to ask and add, and happy to come back.
Yes, no, I have lots of follow-ups to that. They're both to kind of you and Tara. And, you had me also thinking about it's difficult because, what we're talking about here is how do we hold the line on what global solidarity looks like from a multilateral perspective? Because you can understand in ways how the climate crisis, the biodiversity crises are so real. The idea of the messaging that it takes all of us working together isn't antithetical to the messaging that we say often of like, it does take all of us, it takes individuals making different choices and social responsibility, et cetera, but we lose the context of what real multilateral global solidarity looks like. And also we risk losing the analysis of where the current harmful investments are, because we know that a lot of this is redistribution of resources that is not within the hands of individuals. It's not within the hands of local municipalities. And it is potentially within the hands of large transnational corporations, as well as global north governments through their regulations, through the way they approach their tax systems, their trade agreements, et cetera. And that there's this fundamental need not to allow the co-optation of cooperation, if you will, and the co-optation of solidarity as a framing, as if to say that if we are advocating for holding the line on really important norms and understandings of how we are able to actually redistribute resources, and the importance of holding developed countries to account in this regard, that somehow being against other folks also doing more and supporting in the ways that they can. And I think that sometimes we lose that narrative a bit in the way that this advocacy happens, and in sort of the packaging of commitments that happen. We also see that in both of these spaces, and we try to always weave the connections between the 3 Rio conventions, desertification, biodiversity, and climate, because what's happening in one tends to happen in the other. And we know that our solutions need to be intersectional across these issues. that the trends repeat themselves. And so we find ourselves really having to challenge what is an increasing shift away from real action by governments to shift kind of systemically their practices, both globally, their foreign policy practices, their macroeconomic practices, towards the packaging of commitments of small scale, what are really small scale in the great in the macroeconomic world, commitments of $20 million here, $100 million here, and that becomes the successful outcome of these processes. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a real challenge with that, both because those are really hard to be held accountable to, and also I think we can't underestimate the importance of your point here on it doesn't help us shift away and transition away from an extractive model if we are really not honing in on seeing natural resources as a public good and protecting the commons and understanding some of the fundamental values of these conventions and what they were founded on, including equity, including common but differentiated responsibilities, and including things like the polluter pay principles, which we could be doing a lot more in terms of solutions to really be holding polluters accountable through demands for how they kind of pay for finance. And so going back to you, Tara, and then Mishi, for you to come in on this,
possibly come
oh
come
yeah,
back
no,
there,
add
Bridget,
on.
a bit. I think you touched like a very important aspect as well, especially I mean, like rephrasing, very important aspect of like this protecting the commons and the value of biodiversity. In the last decision, the CBD asked the Secretariat to produce a report. Literally on the value of biodiversity, and the report in so many ways it is a fairly account of like the value of diversity is not only a market value, but also this is the mother earth, it's source of livelihood, it's source of health, it's source of pride, like all the things that feminists have been saying for the longest time. However, what we are seeing, and I think linking it to your point in terms of the intersectionality as well of all these processes, what we are seeing increasingly, the pressure from the UNFCCC, for example, and carbon capture has pushed a lot of the pressure within the biodiversity space as well. So now forest and reserved area, all of it are marketed as a carbon sink, and they've been pitched as a way in which government can earn money from carbon sinks. So like as fulfilling the UNFCCC commitment, but in so doing now, you are having private companies who comes to these territories and register this forest, for example, and by doing so, they put now sets of the restriction, the source of those forests in terms of as a small thing as collecting herbs for medicine or firewood is not activities that can happen after this forest, for example, has been registered as a carbon sink. So that like that connection, as we as feminists trying to make connection, I think our opponents have like way ahead in terms of making those connections and making sure what has been blocked, for example, from this conversation find its way and illegality in the other convention. And that's why it's sort of like urgent for us really to have a holistic approach in how we engage and we address this issue, because that is what we are seeing. But also we are seeing as well private sector and government also using what is public and popular. So some of these small convention, which more often than not, they're not in a public eye, there is not big scrutiny. That is where they're walking away from their obligation the most, because they're not seeing that public scrutiny, for example, unlike the UNFCCC, where you have like hundreds of media, you have active civil society that will scrutinize that. The same way, when it's not happening there, then you find there is more harm that is being made in terms of like walking away from obligation. So that is all I wanted to add, and I can now go back to
No,
Tara.
it's a really important point. And again, it got me thinking about this the reason why we try to build the analysis coherently across these spaces and conversations, and why it feels so important, something that we are trying to do, again, as said, through a series of learning dialogues in the coming months, through having conversations like this, keeping all of us together and connected and really building the ecosystem, is because all of these things are true, and as well as the fact that there's a deep scarcity and a need for resourcing now, for resourcing solutions. And where we find ourselves is often in the space of accepting resources or calling for resources without having the capacity to really analyze the vehicles of those resources, the quality of that funding, and the ways in which they are challenging the ability to approach these crises in an intersectional way. And it very much aligns to how the questions we've been talking about internally and within our networks about how you deliver a just transition and the role of resources in delivering that transition. And that challenge of why our advocacy can't just stop with a number, right? Where is that number coming from? How is it being delivered? What is it sourcing? Who has ownership, access, and control are all things that are challenging but fundamental to ask. We have about 13 minutes left that we scheduled for this conversation together. And knowing that this is something that particularly we've spent hours discussing before, maybe a question to sort of both of you, and Tara, I'll start with you. As we think about, again, the space of scarcity, where we're often in conversations on how do we make climate finance, how do we deliver climate finance in general? How do we deliver it in a way that works for people and planet and the intersections between them? And then we're in these very specific conversations, like how do we make the Green Climate Fund work better? How do we shift philanthropy to be funding at the intersections of gender and climate? We have all these very specific conversations. Are there any broader things around these kind of intersections of gender and finance, gender and climate finance, environment finance, that you really think that we need to get right, that maybe we're not having the right conversation around, or things that keep you up at night as you think about these issues?
Yes, definitely. And it goes so much to what you were just saying about considering the vehicles for this finance, and what Mishi was saying in terms of having this more holistic viewpoint. I think we have to spend more time building up these alternative mechanisms of truly delivering the type of climate finance we want to see. Because the risk is, if we are not doing that, we might get part of what we're asking for, which is more of what's going to be called climate finance, but it's going to be delivered through the same old mechanisms and the same actors that have been replicating these colonial inequalities of wealth extraction, of perpetuating debt service, of having these models of voting and governance that are grossly unequal. And so to avoid having climate finance that's going to be delivered through MDBs, multilateral development banks, for example, we have to build up our alternatives. The Green Climate Fund was envisioned as one of those alternatives, but we saw with its most recent replenishment that when you account for inflation and the increasing costs of climate inaction, with every year that we're not doing enough, there wasn't really a scale up of the resources that were allocated to this alternative. And also we're struggling to still make sure that the Green Climate Fund remains a viable alternative and is not operating in the same ways that MDBs do. We have to build up the capacity, and we already have the willingness of women's funds to serve as intermediaries for distributing direct, accessible finance to community-centered solutions, to those local actors that are doing this feminist work and that are really rights-based. And so we need to make sure that we are positioning these alternatives as able to absorb the additional climate finance that we are fighting for. And that's going to be really critical to ensure that the answers to the gender responsiveness, to the feminist approaches that we're asking for, are not tokenized, that we're not conflating women-led climate action with climate action that is truly challenging the existing gender inequalities and advancing gender equality in ways that are feminist, in ways that are recognizing the interlinkages with true visions of peace and democracy and participatory and inclusive decision making. And so without these alternate mechanisms and the qualities and the elements that they're helping to uphold in the system, we're not having the full conversation that we need to have around climate finance. And that is what keeps me up at night.
That is a very eloquent sign off. I feel like it should be uh, in your email signature. I'm going to come back to you, Tara, also to maybe pull up and give folks a preview of the 5 dimensions that you've been working on feminist climate finance. But Mishi, how about you? Would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think just to add what Tara has said in terms of really, and what you've asked, Bridget, really being mindful of the mechanism. I think what makes me up at night is really the fear of like all this hard work that we are doing, advocating for finance. We have like ambitious goal, but all of it ending to end up in the NDBs, just and giving private sector all this easy money that they're not even fighting for because that's the only mechanism that is there. Like these trillions, if we are not keen, will just end to the hands of the private sector. So it's really, really concerning to me, like how do we do that, right? And it won't just end to the end of private sector. This money that we are fighting for can generate more debt to countries, can generate more debt to communities. So that question, and I think we are not articulating it enough in terms of the capacity, in terms of the solution, in terms of the channel, so that we are not doing work for the same people that we say that this is not where the money should be channeled to. And the other aspect I think that I believe we should do more of is really campaigning as well, not just to get new money, but disinvesting from the harm. There is a lot of harm that is being caused, and resources need to be stopped to go there so that we cannot keep on accelerating this harm. Because as much as we can invest in good, but if there is this tons of resources continue to be invested in harm, then that question is not going to balance. So we need to radically disinvest in harm so that at least the good that we are doing are able to balance out. And last, DC has been a sort of like a feminist, quote unquote, nightmare that I have to deal with like every day because we keep on hearing as well from our colleagues, indigenous people in local communities, when you ask like, what resources do you need? And some of them, they just say we don't need money. Just get off our land and our resources. We just want peace. We just want to live in tranquility. We just want, let us be us. So what does it mean in terms of resources? What does it mean? And this is where the quality of resources that is a conversation that we need to have, and what support that is needed, because we shouldn't also be trapped in this capitalist that everything needs to have a dollar value. There are things that doesn't have dollar value. And there's some of the community, they just want to be left free from violence, free from extraction, free from external interference. They just want to live in peace. And what does it mean in our ask for finance? So those are the things that really keep me up at night. You can
No,
imagine
and
I'm not sleeping much.
yeah, I know. I stay up at night too, but I'm really happy that we have you and Tara and many other activists and feminists in these spaces bringing these really critical conversations and concerns. And I think again for me it is again in this moment of scarcity across women's funds, feminist organizations, indigenous peoples groups. How are we still giving ourselves the space to bring critical analysis so that in scarcity our demand for more is not at the uh, uh, in spite of our analysis of the quality and the vehicles in which it's delivered. And that's really hard to hold, but I truly think it is about us building how we are connected together, bringing this kind of analysis that cuts across these issues, the intersectional analysis into spaces. And it's part of our commitment as we do in the ways that we can to be able to foster these collaborations, connections, and connected analysis of how we want to approach actually getting resources where they need to go. But what is, that question that you left us with is what does that look like, and making sure we're not assuming. That's always important. We shouldn't do anything. We should never assume to know what is needed at a community level and in particular issues. Tara, I'm going to just ask you to kind of close us off in this last part of this conversation with maybe giving a highlight to one of the ways in which you've been trying to articulate how climate finance that is feminist is not just including the word gender in, or, creating a gender action plan. Again, not to undervalue those things. We fight for them very hard and they are critical and important. But anything you want to share with us in terms of that, and a flag to folks that more to come.
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. So in terms of thinking about a framework for the dimensions of feminist climate finance that I've been working on, just as a way to make sure that we're not limiting this conversation, that we're having this full conversation. I think one of the things that comes to mind that we haven't talked as much about is the importance of transparency and accessibility as part of that system. The transparency that, as you were talking about, Mishi, to even know what is happening in the name of climate on your lands and the lands that are accessible to you, so that there can be accountability, for example, for processes of free, prior, and informed consent that should be iterative and continuous. And the ways in which the information of climate finance flowing at every level needs to be transparent so that our feminist work can work to help make sure that it is more accountable, that whatever mechanisms are being used, that we're continually fighting for them to be improved, and that we're able to then use what we are learning to feed back into the system of advocacy. And I think that brings to one last point, which is the importance of advocacy in improving the system, and the importance of having finance that supports feminist movement building and that supports advocacy, so that we can be having the right conversations with the right actors at the right levels.
Excellent. And so we have a new brief coming out, I think sometime this week, that folks will be able to see on. Tara's done some work to try to capture what we see as the 5 dimensions of feminist climate finance, is again an advocacy tool. It's just one of a few pieces that we were trying to really build into the narrative of what's at stake at these intersections. We will do a recording of this conversation, in as much as it's useful for those of you who are trying to understand what's happening at these upcoming at this upcoming COP, and what's been happening at these more recent policy meetings, and how they relate to other aspects of multilateralism. Because again, I think for us, it's really about how we much more deeply connect our efforts to being able to resource a transition away from the current extractive, militarized economy that we are all seated in, and trying to do advocacy around, towards one centered on feminist understandings and analysis of peace and care, and what that means in terms of doing work. And I think the thing that keeps me up at night is how to make sure folks who are designing their work now to be working more collaboratively around climate justice and environmental justice, that they see this work is deeply intersectional. So if you are working on peace, conflict, you are working on climate justice and environmental justice. And similarly, if you're working around gender-based violence or education, you are already intersecting with these issues. And it's really about how we can build that ecosystem more broadly. So thank you for joining us.